Thank you, Ravind. Um, there are quite a number of interesting issues to raise, but maybe I'll just refer to one or two. You began saying that we've won the intellectual argument, by which you mean that you've not seen a valid counter-argument. And I agree with you. I think that's right. But you also noted that institutions are slow to change. And I also agree with you on that. But now part of the problem, as you noted, is, well, first of all, there are people, prominent sociologists, prominent social scientists, who are simply indifferent to the whole idea. I think that is one of our big problems. If you sit down with many people and explain the problem, if you have discussions and conferences and seminars and so on, everyone would agree, yes, we need to be more global, we need to be more universal, we need to recognize diversity. But when it actually comes to doing the work, they are at best indifferent. So the way we teach, for example, social theory is still according to the Marx, Weber, Durkheim formula. And not only is there lack of a diversity in culturally speaking, but also in terms of gender. I think in most programs, women are still not, as far as teaching is concerned, are not seen as founders of sociology. But the other obstacle which you pointed to is the nativism, what I call nativism, so-called alternatives that are actually as ethnocentric as the Eurocentrism that they are critiquing, and they tend to discredit the whole idea of alternative discourses. I don't know if you followed Stomka's, I guess it was something like a diatribe against these ideas. But his criticism is valid if he was if it was directed against nativism, but not against a lot of the stuff that we are doing. So what I want to ask you is this. Institutions are slow, and there are many things about institutions that we cannot do, right? But one thing that we do have control over as university professors and not administrators, but as teachers in the university, we have control over the curricula, right? We, for example, textbooks, theory texts. Why haven't we been moving in those areas where we do have control, where we have some control over? This is what I'd like to ask.
One reason I think why I'm glad that you agree that we have won the argument in a sense, and the problem then is, how to turn it into practice, into teaching, into knowledge agendas, research agendas, and so forth. One of the reasons for the difficulty, one of the reasons for the resistance that we have certainly encountered is the changes in the university world itself over the last 30 years or so, as universities have become more dominated by a managerial elite. Universities have become much more impacted by the need to extract money from a global student market. So universities themselves have become more corporatized, and as part of the constructions of the relevant markets, we've been giving enormous significance to league tables, to competition between universities understood as competitive firms rather than cooperative units in the system. And hence, all those league tables of journals, as well as universities, and the pressure on us to publish in the top journals, which of course almost all North American, and the ones that aren't are likely to be from the UK. So there are real institutional pressures at the moment to conform to an established global North conception of what knowledge is, what legitimate methods are, what the knowledge production process really consists of. And I think when many of our colleagues resist or as you put it, are indifferent to the kind of claims that we are making, an important reason is that they are responding to the incentives in this new neoliberalised university system, which push in another direction. So that part of our problem is actually, a widely shared problem of how to change those imperatives and incentives. That, I think, is one of the important reasons for the drag in, for instance, in changing curriculum, rewriting textbooks. Though the textbook thing, of course, is that most of the textbooks are produced by a small number of commercial publishers centred in the global north, whose interests are not necessarily served by the kind of agenda we want to pursue. I nevertheless think there are a lot of fissures and tensions and contradictions and possibilities in this structure. I don't think of neoliberalism or managerialism as a juggernaut with no possibilities of intervention or change. I think we can argue that there are powerful reasons why universities, even in responding to a global market, should become much more culturally diverse in the content of their curriculum. And universities at the national level are subject to pressures about inclusion and exclusion on social grounds, which are also part of the argument we can put forward for a social justice orientation in the curriculum itself. I'm therefore interested in circulating the many beginnings actually that people have made with producing curricula, with producing teaching materials of one kind or another, online as well as print. It's one of the things that I just begin to do in the paper, pointing to things like Gurminder's website on global theory. The more we can do to circulate those, and possibly there's something that can be done through an organisation like the ISA to create sites and facilities for exchange of curriculum, teaching materials, etc., outside the commercial context. I think there are many possibilities for sharing and circulating that we have begun to work on that, but can be accelerated, certainly.
I'm also wondering, I agree with almost everything you said, but the power of the countervailing forces. For example, I currently work for an Indian university, which the Vice-Chancellor is obsessed with the university rankings. And we've had people from Times Higher Educational Supplement have been, and we had a conference 2 weeks ago, the President of India came to open it, and it was always about this fact there's no Indian university in like the top 100. And we are all being pushed to do this. And one mechanism through which we're pushed to do this is, believe it or not, we are paid for publishing. I get 20,000 rupees if I publish in an internationally recognized peer journal. But the university has a list of the journals they consider to be the appropriate journals. It has nothing to do with the quality of the paper per se, They assume if it's in an international peer-reviewed journal, it must be okay. But if I publish an equally good paper in something that's not on their list, then I don't get my 20,000 rupees. Now, whether it's having any effect on the actual publication pattern of my colleagues is not clear. But what is clear is this reference back to models which are probably completely inappropriate in this situation, but clearly have enormous power. I mean, how does one undermine that kind of obsession with the assumption that we really want to be like Oxford and, you know, that is the goal of a university, say, in the South, is to become like a university in the North.
Oxford and Harvard. Harvard always appears as number one in those lists.
No, Oxford's number one.
No.
Yes, it is this year.
It's Harvard.
Yes, it is.
No question.
Harvard's only number 3 this year.
Your list might be different from mine. Yeah, look, it's important. It's a key part of the construction of universities as a market system. And it obsesses our managers too. So, you know, just in the last week, the University of Sydney has announced it's just appointed a brand new Pro-Vice Chancellor who's been photographed in a lovely charcoal grey suit standing in front of a corporate building gazing out into the future. And his role is, this is what the website says in these exact words, this Pro-Vice Chancellor has been appointed to drive research excellence at the University of Sydney, which of course means publishing more papers in Nature and Science, and if we're in the social sciences, the American Economic Review and the American Sociological Review. That's what it means. That's their understanding. So part of the struggle, part of what has to happen is actually a struggle against the managerialization of the world of knowledge. And that, of course, involves industrial struggle as well as intellectual struggle. But partly also, it's a matter of finding languages and concepts that can offer a kind of credible alternative to this mad idea that there's just one dimension of difference among universities or among academics, and that the perfect model which we should all strive to be is Harvard. Now, all right, I'll give you Oxford, but Harvard I know better because I actually taught there at one stage. And, you know, this is a small university floating on a gigantic sea of money. I mean, it's the endowment of Harvard is, if I've got the figure from memory correct, $41 billion US. And there's no other there's no university in the developing world or in the global periphery, even rich countries like Australia, that has tiny fraction of that sort of money. The idea that we should become like that is literally absurd. I mean, it's just ridiculous. But we can become a hell of a lot better than Harvard at a lot of other things, a lot of other ways, including cooperation, respect, relevance, engagement, and so forth. So part of our task is actually to develop and valorize a concept of relevant audiences or relevant forms of publication, rather than simply, you know, a position on the global hierarchical league table. And similarly, thinking about relationships with students, which are qualitatively different from the increasingly commodified model of teacher-student relationships that is currently dominant. I'm sure, everybody knows these are things that everybody knows, so to speak, but need to be articulated and fought for, and finding allies to fight for them too.
So I'll speak. Okay. Hi, Raven. Raven, I'll start from John's comment, like the place where John teaches, I used to teach and I teach somewhere else now. So in that way, I could kind of totally kind of picture skew, relate to the way how the VC works over there, and in that way. So in that sense, in that juncture, I could relate with what Professor Bhamra was kind of talking about, relating to your work on neocolonialism and to that of neoliberalism, where I believe that it's not about the intersection. Like, say, for example, I'm very familiar with your work in that way, working on sexuality, working on post-colonial theories, working on how you perceive global South, theories of the Southern theories, per se. But two things that kind of come to my mind here is kind of taking the narrativized way, how John has put it here, is it's say, for example, it's not about just the knowledge of the West, but how we kind of see, circulate. I'm more comfortable in just how we kind of look at how knowledge is produced in the non-West, now the politics of knowledge in itself.
It's immensely difficult. If you like, the dominant knowledge formation, what I called imperial science, is now institutionally linked into the commodified, marketized university system. Some possibilities for changing it have been lost, and new sites for the reproduction of that knowledge formation are created in the commodified, privatized universities that have been proliferating in the global periphery. In India, I know, perhaps most spectacularly in Brazil, where the private sector of universities now very largely outweighs the public universities in terms of enrollments. It's spectacularly greater. I think, I hesitate to offer any kind of formula for what people should be doing in institutional contexts that I know very little about in a hands-on way, and I've never taught in that kind of setting. But it does seem to me that, or I at any rate would hope, that we can find new ways. I mean, it may involve invention, it may involve imaginative uses of local cultural resources outside the existing knowledge formation, but that will produce forms of knowledge and discussions of knowledge and forms of learning that speak more directly to the communities in which these institutions are located. Now, I've put that in a very abstract way, but it's the kind of thing that creative educators are doing all the time, and which is, spoken of theoretically in some writings about adult education, such as Pedagogy of the Oppressed, where creative syntheses between the knowledge brought into the position by university-trained intellectuals are combined with local cultural materials and the learning needs of local learners in imaginative and progressive ways. So, I'm subject to correction here, and you know more about this than I do, but I would hope that even the tendency to commodify knowledge hasn't eliminated the possibilities of doing that kind of creative teaching. And if that kind of creative teaching can be done, then knowledge construction projects, that is to say research, can also grow out of and around them. And you might have, one might hope, a multiplication of knowledge projects around the periphery of the system, which in due course might link and connect through what's at an international level called South-South connections.